Okay, I know a few days ago I said that I'm gonna try and not get into so many confrontations, that sort of thing, and I've tried to uphold that. But that doesn't mean that I've stopped making videos about things that I have views on. Um, I've just had a conversation with a Chinese friend of mine, guy I knew over there when I was teaching on QQ, which is Chinese social sort of networking site, so to speak. And somehow we got into an interesting conversation about. It was well natured, I think. It wasn't like a heated debate, although it was a bit of a debate. But well natured, like I say, this guy's a friend of mine. It was concerning the. We were discussing the situation in Ukraine a little bit, and I said there's some signs that this could be going like Yugoslavia, which I do believe. I think it's going down that way. And he said, "Don't mention Yugoslavia," and I think then I knew where this was going. And we got on to talking about how the US bombed the Chinese embassy in Belgrade in 1999, and I believe at least 3 embassy staff were killed. That was an incident that really provoked a very big backlash from China, and sort of a hysterical wave of Chinese nationalism. I can understand the anger because innocent people died, i.e., non-combatant people died. They didn't have to, and it was sort of a raw anger at American military power, I guess. But I am not convinced that there was any deliberate attempt by the Americans to bomb that embassy. I mean, what would they have gained from it by attacking China? It wouldn't have made any sense. That potentially would have triggered a world war, so it wouldn't have made any sense from the Americans' point of view. I believe, based on what I could see, that it was a tragic accident. Anyway, Clinton apologised for it, but still, that issue is brought up every time. Every time I see a debate or I'm involved in a debate regarding China's role in the world and its attitude really to foreign affairs. And I'd like to talk about this a little bit because China's a country I'm deeply interested in, and there's many things I like about it. But one thing I do notice, and this is something that might be provocative, but it's an honest observation, it is one of the least honest societies I have ever been in terms of self-reflection. Now, I want to be careful how I say this because I don't want people to misunderstand. I'm not saying individual Chinese people are dishonest. They are, some of them, but it's not. I'm not saying that as a general thing. I'm not saying the Chinese are liars, something like that. Of course not. There's many decent Chinese people who are honest and they just reflect on what they see, just like the rest of us. Just like anyone who's living in this world, they reflect on what they say and they have opinions on it. But I still strongly believe that China as a nation is not honest, especially about its own history. And there is a common trend I see with this. Basically, it goes something like this: China's been invaded many times. China's building itself. It's a developing country. It's building itself as a nation. Um, every nation has a national condition that it has to work with. That's generally the argument. So the idea is um, China was always the victim because it was invaded many times. China is a developing country, therefore the expectations that are on developed countries aren't fair to use against China. And every nation has a national condition, whatever that means. Like that somehow justifies some of the things that are going on. I'd like to address each point. First of all, about the invasions. That is true, China did have a history of invasions in the 19th century. We know about the Opium Wars, we know about the humiliation that China did face. I acknowledge that. However, I do think it's disproportionately used as an excuse in debates today. The Opium Wars have no relevance to today's issues. no matter how much China felt humiliated at that time, constantly bringing them up is getting a little bit, I just think it's void, because most countries have had an experience of invasion in their history. Britain, by the way, has had an experience of invasion after invasion. Now, granted, going further back, but nevertheless, it's had a history of it, and we're a much smaller country than China. Now, I'm not ignorant. I know that a lot of Chinese, that it's something that's raw in the Chinese psyche, especially because the most recent invasions were, of course, the Japanese. That's still within living memory, so it's still a very raw thing. I understand that, but what I can't accept is that it's always used as an excuse to hide from the very real crimes against humanity that has taken place at the hands of various Chinese regimes, whether it be various dynasties or the modern Communist Party. The simple reality is more Chinese have died at the hands of those in power in Beijing than from any outside invader, including Japan. That's a controversial statement, I know that, but it is a basic fact. And it's not that I'm saying those things didn't happen. It's not that I'm saying there wasn't a case for genuine anger at outside influence, especially Japan. I mean, some of the things the Japanese done in the Second World War were absolutely sickening. I'm not saying that people don't have a right to be angry about that, but what I do resent is the fact that there's this focus on China's history of outside invasion, whilst the massive, massive crimes committed by the Mao regime are either overlooked, ignored, or, oh yeah, we know that happened, you know what, it's just a secondary thing. From an outsider's perspective, that's something that's very hard to understand and very hard to accept. I say very hard to accept because outsiders are always scapegoated. Actually, at heart, the Chinese Communist Party is extremely jingoistic. Extremely jingoistic. Now, you could say, well, every government in the world looks after the interests of its own country. That's fine. And I'm not saying other governments don't also scapegoat outsiders. They do. But in the case of China, I can't think of any other leading country. I'm not including countries like North Korea, which I'm talking about leading countries in the world today that are so dishonest about their own history as is China. Now, the thing I often hear is, oh, well, look at America's record, look at all the foreign wars America's been involved in. The very important difference is that American people can freely talk about that, generally without fear of arrest. Americans can say, oh, what we done in Vietnam was terrible, and yeah, they might get into a heated debate with other Americans, but they're not going to be arrested for that. That is a very important difference. In China, now things are gradually improving, and I'm going to make another video about why I believe I am objective on China, but I still believe that there's definitely an inconsistency here. It's entirely okay in China to talk about the Opium Wars, to talk about how terrible America is, and etc., etc. And the Communist Party not only allows that, they encourage it, because they are jingoistic at heart, but the huge problems that take place within China are ignored. Now, for me, it seems strange that the 3 people who died in that embassy bombing, their lives seem to be worth more to Chinese ultranationalists than the hundreds gunned down in Beijing in 1989. To me, that's just an inconsistent. You can't say that you can't make the excuse, oh, China's a developing country, it's got its own condition, therefore we're going to have this nationalist outrage when something happens against China, but when it's the Chinese regime doing the persecution of Chinese people, we're just going to ignore that. That's dishonest, it's inconsistent. And really this is a byproduct of a one-party system, whereby there's almost no objectivity in China. You know, people will get offended by that and they say, oh, there is, we do debate things. But really, honestly, if you're a Chinese person, right, honestly, Forget all the front, forget putting on this nationalist sort of thing. Honestly ask yourself, in China, are we entirely honest about our own history? Do we entirely discuss our own history? Do we really look at both sides of Mao's record, or do we just glorify one side? Because it seems to me that at the moment Mao's record is portrayed as 70% positive and 30% negative. But that is a massive, massive underestimation of the pain and misery that he caused, and not as an accident through deliberate policies designed to subjugate the people of China, designed to bring about chaos so that he could rebuild from the chaos and he'd have absolute power. That was the agenda of Maoism. And the thing is, these events were within living history. I'm not talking about something that happened hundreds of years ago. I'm talking about things that were within 40 years ago. And yet that seems to be forgotten, whilst the Opium Wars 150 years ago are remembered. And I think it's because the CPC has a track record of using anger at outsiders in order to hide their own crimes. And I think that's despicable. China has long, I mean, think about it. China's 4,000 or 5,000 year old civilization. It's only really been open for 30 years. So there's still a massive amount of inward-looking attitudes within China. Now, I'm not saying that people never admit China's problems. I'm not saying that. You know, the average Chinese person will acknowledge problems exist, like corruption and so on, and the average Chinese person is very angry about it. So it's not a case that it's not like North Korea where they're so brainwashed to sort of say, oh, China has no problems. I'm not saying it's like that. Nevertheless, there is a tendency to gloss over China's modern history whilst obsessing over the record of, for example, European powers and Japan. Japan I'm a little bit more understanding of because it is closer in time and Japan hasn't fully accepted its guilt on that. So I can understand the anger over Japan's record because I don't believe they've fully really taken responsibility for that. I can understand that, and Japan did do some terrible things. So to some extent I'm more understanding of that. However, when I see the Opium Wars brought up, something that happened 150 years ago, yes, they were wrong. Okay, I'm British, I acknowledge they were wrong, but definitely they were not worse than what Mao done in the 60s. No way. And it does anger me that the CCP is so influential in getting people to focus on those things and ignoring the crimes that they have committed. I think it's sad, but I also think it's very frustrating because the Chinese people are being denied their own history. There's an entire generation of young Chinese growing up today that aren't even aware of the Tiananmen Square crackdown. That's tragic. That is utterly tragic. And this thing about it's a national condition, like China has a right to do whatever it wants because it's a unique country. That's a phony excuse. We live in an interconnected world. Now I know China is unique in the sense it's got the world's biggest population. It's got a long history. Every country has its own history, right? I understand that. But that doesn't mean that there shouldn't be some universal standards on things like human rights and transparency. To me, that's just a basic truth. And I just get tired every time that that a foreigner says something about China, then there's this nationalist backlash. And this to me just demonstrates that China is actually a very insecure nation, because a confident nation is one that can admit its faults, is one that can confront its own past. China is showing that it's willing to do neither. Yes, I know Xi Jinping has acknowledged that corruption's a problem, he's trying to do something about that. But nevertheless, they continue to foster the personality cult around Mao, which only shows that they're continuing to hide his record. Now, I have been to China. I have seen children's textbooks, and those textbooks glorify Mao. like he was a great man, like he never done anything wrong. That just shows just how dishonest a society China is, and I think it's tragic. And no doubt there'll be Chinese ultranationals coming onto this video telling me I don't know anything about China, telling me I'm wrong, telling me that it's all the fault of Western propaganda, etc., etc. But to me that will only demonstrate the very point I'm talking about. And I think it's tragic. I really hope in the future this situation can change.